The Beatles. Presentation by Mike Tucci. The Beatles' influence on popular music in America was like no other. They caused an initial fervor, a mania period, when teenagers expressed their excitement at their concerts and public appearances. But the Beatles, like their predecessors, but even more so, progressed beyond the stage and became a cultural force. Their compositions and attitudes transforming the way pop music was expressed by large numbers of people. The Beatles later experimented with several genres ranging from pop ballads to psychedelic and hard rock, often incorporating classical elements in innovative ways. The Beatles were an English rock band that formed in Liverpool in 1960 with John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. They became widely regarded as the greatest and most influential act of the rock era. Lennon was performing with his amateur skiffle group, the Quarrymen, at a church picnic on July 6, 1957, in the Liverpool suburb of Woolton, when he met Paul McCartney, whom he later invited to join his group. Soon they were writing songs together, such as One After 909. By the year's end, McCartney had convinced Lennon to let George Harrison join the group. The name of the band changed to Johnny and the Moondogs in 1958, and in 1960, an art school friend of Lennon's, Stu Sutcliffe, became their bassist. Sutcliffe couldn't play a note, but had recently sold one of his paintings for a considerable sum, which the group used to upgrade its equipment. The band was once again rechristened to the Silver Beatles. A few months later, however, the silver was dropped and amended to the Beatles. Tommy Moore was the band drummer until Pete Best replaced him in August 1960. Once Best had joined, the band made its first 4 trips to Hamburg, Germany, where they performed mostly Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Carl Perkins, and Buddy Holly covers. In December, Harrison was deported back to England for being underage and lacking a work permit. But by then, their 30-set weeks on stage of Hamburg beer houses had honed and strengthened their repertoire. On February 21st, 1961, they debuted at the Cavern Club on Matthew Street in Liverpool, beginning a string of nearly 300 performances there over the next couple of years. On April 1961, they again went to Hamburg, where Sutcliffe left the group to become a painter, while McCartney switched from rhythm guitar to bass. The Beatles returned to Liverpool as a quartet in July. Unfortunately, Sutcliffe died from a brain hemorrhage in Hamburg less than a year later. Pete Best, then considered the group's undisputed sex symbol, was asked to leave the group on August 16, 1962, and Ringo Starr, who was a drummer with a popular Liverpool group, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, was added just in time for the group's first recording session. The Beatles' early success had been attributed to their band manager Brian Epstein. The band trusted him without hesitation. Epstein tried landing the Beatles a record contract, but nearly every label in Europe rejected the group. In May 1962, however, producer George Martin signed the group to EMI's Parlophone subsidiary. On September 11th, the Beatles cut 2 originals, Love Me Do and P.S. I Love You, which became their first UK top 20 hit in October. In early 1963, Please Please Me went to number 2, and they recorded an album of the same name in one 10-hour session on February 11, 1963. In addition to handling the Beatles' business affairs, Epstein often stepped in to mediate personal disputes among the group. By mid-year 1963, the Beatles were given billing over Roy Orbison on a national tour, and the hysterical outbreak of Beatlemania had begun. On February 7, 1964, screaming mobs met the band at New York City's Kennedy Airport, and more than 70 million people watched each of their appearances on The Ed Sullivan Show on February 9th and 16th. In April 1964, Can't Buy Me Love became the first record to top the American and British charts simultaneously. In that same month, the Beatles held the top 5 positions on the Billboard singles charts. Can't Buy Me Love, Twist and Shout, She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, and Please Please Me. The Beatles' first movie, A Hard Day's Night, opened in America in August. It grossed $1.3 million in its first week. The band was aggressively merchandised. Beatles wigs, clothes, dolls, and Beatles lunchboxes. Also a cartoon series aired on ABC TV. By 1965, Lennon and McCartney rarely wrote songs together, although by contractual and personal agreement, songs by either of them were credited to both. The Beatles toured Europe, North America, the Far East, and Australia that year. Their second movie, Help, was filmed in England, Austria, and the Bahamas in the spring and opened in the U.S. in August. On August 15th, they performed to a 55,000 fans at New York Shea Stadium, setting a record for the largest concert audience. McCartney's Yesterday went to number 1 and would become one of the most often covered songs ever written. With the 1965's Rubber Soul album, the Beatles' ambitions began to extend beyond love songs and pop formulas. Their success led adults to consider them, along with Bob Dylan, the spokesman for youth culture, and their lyrics grew more poetic and somewhat more political. In summer 1966, controversy erupted when a remark John Lennon had made to a British newspaper reporter months before was widely reported in the U.S. The quote, "Christianity will go. It will vanish and shrink. We're more popular than Jesus." It incited denunciations and Beatles record bonfires. The anti-Beatle backlash was particularly intense in the United States, where the group was set to begin a tour just 2 weeks after the controversy erupted. It included death threats against the group. Largely out of concern for safety of his fellow band members, Lennon apologized at a Chicago press conference. The Beatles gave up touring after an August 29, 1966 concert at San Francisco's Candlestick Park and made the rest of their music in the studio, where they had begun to experiment with exotic instrumentation as seen as in the 1965 song Norwegian Wood had featured a sitar, and a tape abstraction such as a reverse track on Rain. Strawberry Fields Forever, part of the double-sided single released February 1967 to fill an unusually long gap between albums, featured an astonishing display of electronically altered sounds and hinted to what was yet to come. With Taxman and Love You Too on Revolver, it took 4 months and $75,000 to record Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band using a then state-of-the-art 4-track tape recorder and building each cut layer by layer. Released in June 1967, it was hailed as serious art for its concept and its range of style and sound, a lexicon of pop and electronic noises such as songs like Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds and A Day in the Life, were carefully examined for hidden meanings. The album spent 15 weeks at number 1, longer than any of their others, and has sold over 8 million copies. On June 25, 1967, the Beatles recorded their new single, All You Need Is Love, before an international television audience of 400 million as part of a broadcast called Our World. On August 27, 1967, while the four were in Wales beginning their 6-month involvement with transcendental meditation, which took them to India for 2 months in early 1968, Brian Epstein died alone in his London flat from an overdose of sleeping pills, later ruled an accident. Shaken by Epstein's death, the Beatles regrouped under McCartney's leadership. In the fall, they filmed Magical Mystery Tour, which aired by BBC TV on December 26, 1967, and later released in the US as a featured film. Although the telefilm was panned by the British critics, fans, and Queen Elizabeth herself, the album's soundtrack contained their most cryptic work yet in I Am a Walrus, a Lennon composition. In August, they released McCartney's Hey Jude, which went to number 1 and sold over 6 million copies before the end of 1968, becoming their most popular single. Meanwhile, the group had been working on the double album The Beatles, frequently called the White Album, which showed their divergent directions. The riffs were artistic, Lennon moving towards brutal confessionals, McCartney leaning towards pop melodies, Harrison immersed in Eastern spirituality and personal, as Lennon drew closer to his wife-to-be, Yoko Ono. Lennon and Ono's Two Virgins, with its full frontal and back nude cover photo, was released the same month as The Beatles, and stirred up so much outrage that the LP had to be sold in wrapped brown paper. The Beatles went to number 1. Two Virgins peaked at number 124. The four joined forces in July and August 1969 to record Abbey Road, featured an extended suite as well as more hits, including Harrison's much-covered Something. While its release that fall spurred a Paul is dead rumor based on clues supposedly left throughout their work, Abbey Road became the Beatles' best-selling album at 9 million copies. Meanwhile, internal bickering persisted. In September, Lennon told the others, "I'm leaving the group. I had enough. I want a divorce." But he was persuaded to keep quiet while their business affairs were untangled. On April 10, 1970, McCartney released his first solo album and publicly announced the end of the Beatles. At the same time, Let It Be finally surfaced, becoming the group's 14th number 1 album, and yielding the Beatles' 18th and 19th chart-topping singles, Let It Be and The Long and Winding Road. Throughout the 70s, as repackages of Beatles music continued to sell, the four were hounded by bids and pleas for a reunion. Lennon's murder by a mentally disturbed fan on December 8, 1980, ended those speculations. In 1988, the Beatles were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. McCartney, citing business conflicts with the other surviving members, did not attend. Relations between him and Harrison, in particular, had been strained for some time. The Beatles anthology, a long-awaited 6-hour television special, was broadcast over 3 nights in 1995, coinciding with the release of a double CD which featured alternate takes, demos, and rare tracks, and premiered the first new song by John, Paul, George, and Ringo since 1970, Free as a Bird. It was a demo recorded by Lennon in 1977 and was completed by the other three and produced by Jeff Lane. It became the Beatles' 34th top 10 single. On November 29, 2001, George Harrison, who was diagnosed with lung cancer in the late 1990s, became the second Beatle to pass away. 3 years later, Capitol Records released all of the Beatles' U.S. albums in both stereo and original mono versions as 2 box sets. September 9, 2009 was a day of 21st century Beatlemania. Apple EMI released remastered versions of the band's studio albums with dramatically improved sound. Also that day, the Beatles Rock Band video game hit the shelves, featuring 45 Beatles songs. By the end of 2009, it had sold more than 1 million copies worldwide. The impact of the Beatles has often been noted but cannot be overstated. The Fab Four from Liverpool, England, startled the ears and energized the lives of virtually all who heard them. Their arrival triggered a musical revolution of the 60s, introducing a modern sound and viewpoint that has parted ways with the worlds of previous decades. The innovation and talent allowed them to successfully cross several genres of music which spanned decades. Their music can be considered as relevant in American culture today as it was the day they played The Ed Sullivan Show in 1964.